Good evening, everyone. Welcome you for our UOH History webinar series 21. At the outset, so once again, I thank you all for making our webinar series successful. So today we have very eminent young scholar, Dr. Rama Mantena, with us from University of Illinois. She has been involved in intellectual history and history of Telugu region, South India. She has been doing a lot of work, fantastic work. So today she is speaking to us on political imaginaries at the end of empire, anti-colonialism and federation in 20th century, South India. So I request my colleague Dr. Varghese to introduce Dr. Rama Mentana formally, and then Rama, you can take over. Over to Dr. Varghese.
Okay, thank you, Professor Bangia. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Rama Mantena, the speaker of the day. Dr. Rama Sundari Mantena, known in short as Rama Mantena, is currently an associate professor in the Department of History and Global Asian Studies in the University of Illinois at Chicago. She is also the associate chair of the Department of History. Dr. Mantena held a PhD in history from the University of Michigan, and she is working in the University of Illinois from 2006 onwards. And her research interests are quite interesting. It includes issues like colonial archives and the production of knowledge, historiography and the practice of history. And more recently, she is also interested in issues related to public spheres, publicity, debates over civil society, with special reference to 20th century South India. And at the University of Illinois, she teaches thematic courses on modern India, on nationalism and colonialism, the British Empire, and women and gender in Indian history. And she has already made significant academic contributions, as Professor Bangia has already said, and which is evident from the huge corpus of publications she has got already. And her first book, I guess this is a book that came out of PhD, is about the production of knowledge with special reference to history in colonial India. And this book is entitled The Origins of Modern Historiography in India, Antiquarianism and Philology, 1780 to 1880, published by Palgrave Macmillan from New York in 2012. And this book examines the everyday practices surrounding the acts of surveying and collecting, antiquarianism in early period of British rule in India. And specifically, it examines the early imperial strategies of producing historical knowledge, and it actually traces the colonial conditions of production of the so-called sources, the forging of a new historical method, and the ascendance of positivist historiography in the 19th century India. And she has also written on related themes like political life in princely Hyderabad, the historical origins of Telangana movement, vernacular publics and political modernity, the question of history in pre-colonial India, and such works are published in various, acclaimed journals like Modern Asian Studies, History and Theory, the American Historical Review, apart from appearing as chapters in edited anthologies. And her new project, which is ongoing, is, and it's from that project, the today's talk actually actually comes from, is about political futures and the end of empire, which is an attempt to rethink the period between empire and nation. And she's referring to the early decades of 20th century, in which one can see the expansion of vernacular publics, of cultures of democratic participation in defining and negotiating not only multifarious cultural identities, but also their relationship to the past. The confrontation of societal inequities, challenging traditional orthodoxies, all these, in effect, usher a heightened era of liberalism and the increased use of the language of political rights and self-determination with open-ended political futures. So, in a sense, the book brings together the narratives of civil society discussions and political life and citizenship with proposals of federated arrangements and calls for provincial autonomy using the particular case of princely state of Hyderabad. And as I said, today's talk comes from this particular work. And today she is going to speak on the political imaginaries of anti-colonialism and federation in the 20th century South India. With these words, I invite Dr. Rama Mantena to make her presentations. Over to you, Dr. Rama.
Thank you. I want to thank both Dr. Bangya and Verghese for inviting me and also for your very kind introduction to my work. You gave a thorough, introduction to what I've been working on since my doctorate over like 15 years ago. So, I guess I don't have to actually talk too much more about the book project I'm working on, since the introduction kind of lays out the broad concerns I have. But basically, it's kind of thinking through political imaginaries at the end of empire has been broadly what I've been concerned with, and it's changed from my earlier book and research that was in a century before. So this was new territory for me, new terrain, but it's been exciting as I've delved into the early 20th century. So in this presentation, I will be talking about anti-colonial politics and kind of thinking through anti-colonial politics in early 20th century South India, but mainly in the Telugu-speaking districts of the Madras Presidency and princely Hyderabad. And in fact, in this presentation, it's primarily will be focused on Hyderabad rather than a comparison between Madras Presidency and Hyderabad, which is what the concern of the broader book project is. So this is new research for me to move into princely state historiography to get a sense of what overlapping themes exist between British India and princely India. In particular, for this presentation or talk, I want to focus on the dynamic debates that took place over questions of federation between the princes and India, popular movements that contested monarchical authority in princely Hyderabad, and how anti-colonialism, as well as discourses of self-determination, shaped the region in the first half of the 20th century. So I try to examine in detail the contradictions of political imaginaries arising out of the princely state of Hyderabad by exploring the divergent trajectories of Hyderabad's administration and the people's movements within the state. I try to illustrate what I call the conservative impulses of federation proposals that were floated by the princes and their advocates. Political movements within the Hyderabad state were anti-colonial and often demanded universal suffrage, and were also anti-monarchical to a limited extent. Or in other words, they challenged monarchical legitimacy in different ways. Because the Hyderabad administration saw anti-colonial nationalism as a direct threat to its own aspirations for independence, political movements within the state had to remain non-threatening, right? While there were no outwardly anti-monarchical political movements in the princely states, there was a push towards responsible government, government from social and political movements based on the principle of popular sovereignty. So, and so this is some of the, some of the things that I've been concerned with is, how to identify anti-monarchical movements, how do they articulate that? And can we kind of think of the push towards responsible government, from these movements, social and political movements within Hyderabad that were pushing towards popular sovereignty as, by nature anti-monarchical, right? So what I try to show in my work is that the emergence of political movements within the princely state of Hyderabad were in effect anti-monarchical. Obviously, they couldn't outwardly be anti-monarchical. In particular, I'm interested in exploring the full range of political imaginaries at the end of empire and how we can understand the contributions of the princely states, which gave rise to different politics and modes of political expression than those in the directly ruled territories of British India. So that's my kind of broad concerns in this presentation, in this chapter, as well as the larger book project as well. So firstly, I'll begin with putting these discussions within the larger framework of global discussions about empire, nation, and federation. What does it mean to turn to empire for a federalist model? And there's been a lot of work recently in thinking globally about federation, and the international kind of global order, and to think back to this period in the early 20th century, with the rise of course, in the interwar period, the League of Nations, and then post-war, the UN, of course. But within this discussion, it really is the earlier decades in the interwar period, and this kind of end of empire period, right? And why proposals for federation were brought up in that particular period. But my concern in kind of opening it up in the larger framework is to understand the distinctions between the different discussions and debates. So I'm going to start with Frederick Cooper, who worked in French West Africa. So in his study of French West Africa, in his book, Citizenship Between Empire and Nation, he raises the question of alternative political futures that were possible in the interwar period and in the subsequent period of decolonization. A question that lies behind this critical literature was why the nation state won out in the early 20th century. Right, so the discussions of federation and federal proposals were, in contrast to the rise of the nation, right, or these kind of parallel developments, the rise of the nation state, and then also these proposals for a federated world, right? So this was a time when dynamic proposals for federation and federated states were being offered up to possibly counter the dangers of majoritarianism of the nation state. The nation state was not an inevitable outcome of anti-colonial struggles, argues Cooper, and that we should not view alternative proposals as less radical because their aim was not the establishment of an independent nation state. A federation in the aftermath of empire, Cooper argues, was such an alternative. For French West African thinkers such as Leopold Senghor, a federation allowed for extending the relationship between France and its colonies. Cooper called this imperial citizenship. And he writes, quote, "The citizenship that French West Africans were claiming in the post-war years was not that of a nation state, but an imperial citizenship in a composite political entity, built by conquest, governed in a way that had subordinated and denigrated its subjects, but which was, activists asserted, to be transformed into a structure that would ensure the rights and cultural integrity of all citizens. Such a conception both assumed the history of colonization and transcended it." End of quote. So that's Cooper. Through the continuing connection between the imperial center of France and the colonies, colonial subjects would be able to achieve greater citizenship rights, such as voting rights and greater representation in the government, without severing ties with its colonial power. So the idea behind continuing a relationship with France was to maintain political and economic stability in the colonies. Gary Wilder, on the other hand, has argued that the Martinique anti-colonial thinker, Aimé Césaire, his ambivalence towards the nation state had to do with the long history of slavery, the Haitian Revolution, and what he calls the problem of freedom in the Caribbean. And this is a quote from him. Quote, "Given this long-term history of emancipation and foreclosure, Antillean actors after World War II approached the prospect of decolonization mindful that freedom was a problem with no ready-made solution." End of quote. So there was a great deal of hesitation on the part of Senghor and Césaire to embrace the nation state as the end goal of anti-colonial struggle. More recently, Adam Getachew argues the high imperial moment within which Senghor and Césaire argue their positions was bound to end in failure, mainly because the French were unwilling to form a federation with their former colonies, giving equal rights and proposing an equivalence between the French and native peoples. In other words, race played an enormous role in shaping post-imperial imaginaries. Rather, Getachew argues that the important post-imperial moment occurred when more creative and strong proposals for federation circulated in relation to the idea of the African Union. So the West African example, as elucidated by Cooper, Wilder, and Getachew, affirmed that even in proposals of federation or a federated state, anti-colonialism encompassed an emancipatory politics that was inclusive of the extension of rights and protections connected to full citizenship and the extension of representative institutions broadly. However, when we turn to British India, it becomes clear that the princely states in India had altogether different political motives when debating federation proposals towards an all India federation of states. These unique principalities viewed the federation debates as a way to weigh alternative political futures, and also on a practical level, a way to assert their own sovereignty and independence from the increasingly dominant and threatening nationalism of the Indian National Congress. Crucially, as I will argue, the proposals for federation offered by the Indian princes lacked a critique of monarchical rule and thus were far from a politics of emancipation. And so this is how I'm making the contrast that the federation, when we look at federation debates during this period, in the interwar period, that political actors were engaged in those debates towards different political goals, right? So what were the particular political problems posed by the princely states in British India? In 1938, after the roundtable conferences in India, British India, discussing the fate of the Indian dominions, Edward Thompson called out the dubious position of the Indian princes. Specifically, Thompson argued that the princes did not possess sovereignty and that they could not hold the British government and the government of India to a settlement dating to the early 19th century. He declared, quote, Whatever the treaties say, this is 1938, and India is a country of 400 million. The dead hand of 1819 cannot fetter 1938 to feudal conditions. End of quote. So as Nehru himself noted, the native states he saw as a relic of an earlier and a reflection of stagnant ideas. Both Thompson and Nehru were reacting to the conflicting set of positions taken by the native states in the late 1930s. Yet the prince's discussions with the British government and the government of India had started much earlier. On August 20th, 1917, Edwin Montagu, the Secretary of State for India, announced in the House of Commons that Indians would gain power in every branch of government, with the ultimate goal being, quote, the gradual development of self-governing institutions with a view to the progressive realization of responsible government in India as an integral part of the British Empire. End of quote. So this also gave way to imploring the native states into constitutional discussions. In line with this goal, a chamber of princes was established by royal proclamation on February 8th, 1921. This carefully worded proclamation stated that the chamber would be a consultative body, but that the internal matters of the native states would be left alone. Quote, my viceroy will take its counsel freely in matters relating to the territories of Indian states generally and in matters that affect these territories jointly with British India or with the rest of my empire. It will have no concern with the internal affairs of individual states or their rulers, or with the relations of individual states with my government, while the existing rights of these states and their freedom of action will in no way be prejudiced or impaired. End of quote. So along with the Simon Commission's review of the Government of India Act of 1919, the Butler Committee was appointed to address the role of the native states in the political reforms in British India and the movement towards dominion status. Sir Harcourt Butler came to India in January of 1928, and though he met with the princes, he did not make an effort to meet with the representatives of the peoples and communities of the princely states. At this stage, the dialogue was solely between the British government and the princes and did not include the demands of the people. The All Indian States People's Conference that took place in Bombay in December of 1927 sent a deputation to the Butler Committee in London in 1928 to make a case for the inclusion of representatives of the people in the Federation discussions. So this is where there's the All India States People's Conference then is an umbrella conference that brings together representatives from the different princely states to make a case for the demands of the people, the prince's subjects, right? The Manchester Guardian interviewed the leaders of the deputation and reported in October 23rd, 1928, the issue dated October 23rd, 1928, that the deputation had organized the trip in order to make their voices heard and their interests taken seriously. In particular, three prominent figures, Professor G.R. Abhyankar from the Law College in Pune, Mr. Paputlal Chudgar, and Diwan Bahadur M. Ramchandra Rao, arrived in London to make their case for why it was important for the state's people to be considered in the discussions between the princes and the Butler Committee. The States People's Conference corresponded with the Butler Committee and asked to be included in the discussions. The princes did not agree to this and did not allow the deputation to be included in the Butler Committee, as they argued that the committee was established solely to determine the relationship between paramount power and the native states as defined by the treaties. So the princes only wanted to talk about the treaties and what powers they can gain, right? The princess argued that the Butler Committee, therefore, could not inquire into the investigation of the relations between the rulers and their subjects. So that the relationship between the rulers and subjects was off the table in the eyes of the princess for the Butler Committee. Professor Abhyankar published a piece titled, quote, titled Self-Determination for the State's People, arguing that the princess had neglected the fundamental rights of its people, namely civil rights and constitutional liberties that should be guaranteed to all states' subjects. Instead, the princess, Abhyankar argued, the princess had misled the British and falsely claimed that the people in native states had basic freedoms, a say in the government, and the right to air their grievances and to rise up against the government if and when necessary. In other words, they had painted a picture in which the princess abided by what the people wanted and recognized that their own princely power was derived from the people. Abhyankar denied that this was the case. In fact, he asserted that the people of the native states had greater powers before the arrival of the British because they at least had the right to depose a corrupt monarch or administration. So this is a claim that Abhyankar makes, that that this existed before colonial rule. With the assertion of paramount power, Abhyankar argues, the British had deprived the people of these rights. Abhyankar argued that because the right of self-determination was due to the people, they had a right to participate in any discussion on the political future of the native states. He asked, quote, when the princes are talking of federation, are they alive to the fact that it is the people of every state who must have a voice in any scheme of federation, end of quote. Furthermore, he argued, quote, the Indian states people, therefore, demand the right of self-determination along with the subjects of British India, not only in matters of common interest, but also in matters of their internal administration. They do not want the Indian princes to rule in an autocratic manner. They further claim that the responsible governments must be established in the states, and the Indian rulers must be made to rule as constitutional monarchs, end of quote. So the deputation led by Abhyankar to London for the Butler Commission made clear to the British public that the states' peoples demanded the right of participation in moving the native princely states toward responsible government in conjunction with British Indian subjects. They reasoned that the political goals of British Indian subjects were inseparable from the state's peoples. He's calling for responsible government, political reforms, but also arguing that the political goals of British Indian subjects were the same or inseparable from the state's people's political goals. In the 1930s, at the beginning of the decade, the Indian National Congress was keen on including the princess in the roundtable conferences that took place in 1930 and to 32 towards the goal of introducing responsible government and representative institutions. The 1928 Nehru Report explicitly stated, quote, indeed, if there ever was a case for a roundtable conference at which perfect understanding could easily be reached, it was this, with the representatives of the princes, of their people, of the British government, and of the people of British India assembled at such a conference, all difficulties would have been solved with mutual goodwill, end of quote. The main contention going forward was who would have the power to shape the internal affairs of the native states. There were indeed divisions within the Chamber of Princes. One faction supported political reforms that would bring subjects of the native states closer to subjects of British India in terms of what rights and liberties they possessed. Participating in conferences was seen as a way to assure the princely states were not excluded from discussions shaping the political agenda of British India. What soon became clear is that the princely states and provinces were thought of as equal partners in the discussions and negotiations of political reforms. An internal report produced by the Hyderabad administration stated, quote, Hyderabad had no direct interest in the political problems which were then agitating British India, and indeed would have liked nothing better than to have been left alone to fashion her own destiny in her own way, end of quote. Hyderabad's administration entered discussions at the Round Table conferences only reluctantly through pressure to do so, and because they were left with no real choice. They often argued that though their relations were with the British Crown, the Crown was acting through the government of India. Therefore, they could not be indifferent to these political discussions that could impact their status. They went on to state that there were two courses open to them. One was for Hyderabad to stay out of the constitutional debates concerning the relations of the British Crown with British India, the logic being that Hyderabad had formed an independent relationship with the British Crown through treaties and that they had no direct legal relationship with the government of India. The other course would be to enter into discussions to support India's aspirations and efforts towards political reforms in British India towards the goal of self-government. If Hyderabad entered into discussions, it could act in its own self-interest and best assure its effective sovereignty over Hyderabad's dominions. After the first roundtable discussion, it was decided that Hyderabad would take the second course and work towards an all India federation. The Hyderabad administration was intent on protecting Hyderabad's sovereignty as an autonomous state and preventing the government of India from gaining any authority over the internal affairs of the princely states. As Kavita Datla has argued, the question of sovereignty, the sovereignty of the princely states, was deliberately left ambiguous by the British. Nehru outright argues that the British were using the princes and their so-called treaties to sow fissures and to weaken the bargaining power of the Indian National Congress. The princes proclaimed that the treaties between native states and the British Crown gave them sovereignty over their territories. The Indian National Congress, on the other hand, made arguments that the British Crown had never determined the policies defining the relations between the government of India and the princely states. In fact, in practice, the government of India had been managing the affairs while staying out of the so-called internal affairs of the native states. These two sets of agendas clashed when it came time to define the parameters and powers of an all-India federation. So while the princes participated in the roundtable conferences, one interesting discussion emerges in terms of what place they could carve out in the discourse of what would emerge after empire in the region. And this is the idea of the native states as conservative islands. Sir Akbar Haidari led the Hyderabad delegation at the roundtable conferences and worked to build a consensus for an acceptable all India federation that would ease the fears of the native states or the princely states and check the power and desires of the British Indian delegates. Haidari's and the Hyderabad delegation's goal was to work towards a federal structure that would give the greatest amount of internal autonomy to Hyderabad. The work towards a federation was based on the assumption that the new government that would come about with the withdrawal of the British in India would not be a continuation of the government of India. Rather, the new government would be an all India federation where the center of power, quote, the center of power will be with the provinces and the states who will have mutually agreed that certain subjects where coordination in the interest of India as a whole is necessary, should be administered through a central agency, the federal government. Invested by its constituent units with the necessary powers, the federal government, unlike the present government of India, will not be the master, but the agent of the several federating units, be they provinces or states. End of quote. It's clear from this statement that the reason the Hyderabad delegation was committed to talks towards a federation was to shape the future of India after Britain's withdrawal. As Hyderabad expressed earlier in the report, that staying out of the discussions would be detrimental to Hyderabad in that decisions would be made without their input. Therefore, being at the center of the roundtable discussions was critical in their eyes, with Hyderabad's leadership in shaping a viable political future for Hyderabad. In the very confidential enclosure of the secret report on the Roundtable Conference, Hyderabad saw itself alongside other princely states as, quote, conservative islands in the ocean of democratic British India, end of quote, and as stabilizing elements in the future legislature where British Indian interests constantly threatened to undermine these elements with their calls for a more democratic polity. In effect, the Roundtable Conferences garnered the support of the princes precisely because the latter believed they would be able to forge a bastion of conservatism and maybe even align with conservative forces within British India. Hyderabad knew that if he positioned Hyderabad as a princely state alongside moderate nationalists in British India, along with minority communities, the extremists would be isolated in their calls for direct action. By positioning the Congress as being driven by extremists, the princes sought to characterize themselves as conservatives. However, it's not clear what exactly their conservatism consisted of. Howard Erdman's 1967 study of the rise of the Swatantra Party as a conservative alternative to Socialist Congress gives us the following definition of conservatism. Quote, conservatism is primarily associated with the aristocratic defense of the feudal agrarian ancien regime. Secondly, conservatism has also come to refer to middle-class resistance to more radical lower-class demands. End of quote. So in India, conservatism took on its own nuances when the princes emerged as the defenders of tradition and legacy. During the constitutional discussions of the 1930s, Liaquat Hayat Khan expressed the general sentiment of the princes at the Second Roundtable Conference in 1931 on November 30th. He says, quote, it would be perfectly fair on the part of the British Indian representatives to ask the Indian states to make sacrifices in the common interest of a greater India. It would be perfectly legitimate on their part to expect that the princes would willingly and gladly cede a certain amount of their power and authority to the newly constituted federal government in order to create one united and undivided India for the benefit of the 350 millions of India's sons and daughters. But certainly it cannot be legitimately argued that the princes should, in course of time, sacrifice all their sacred heritage and legacy in order that British India may realize its political ambition. End of quote. So Khan points to the problems arising from the perspective of the princes. He states that while it is understandable that the princely states will have to give up a few things in federating with the British Indian provinces, he brings attention to the fact that the native states cannot possibly give up their sacred heritage and legacy. And this is how conservatism is expressed by the princes in the language of heritage and legacy, as what the princes want to protect against the extremists in the Congress and their desires to radically transform Indian society and culture. So kind of positioning themselves as gradualists, right? The native states represented historical continuity that needed to be protected against British Indian politics. These transformations that the Congress's extremists were demanding would harm this continuity. The princes also represented conservatism in more ways than one. The attempt to retain control or authority over internal sovereignty indicated their resistance to new political ideologies that were circulating in the British Indian provinces. Ultimately, there were two divergent paths taken by British Indian movements and the Indian states. The princely states, as Khan clearly articulated, attempted to maintain control of their territories and rights, as well as hold on to their heritage and legacy. The princes did this by revisiting treaties between the native states and the British Crown, broaching discussion of the meanings of sovereignty and paramountcy, and finally turning to international law to reserve their unique position they found themselves in, namely between the British government and the government of India. The Congress and other political parties in British India, by contrast, were unable to rely on international law to make their case for political independence. Rather, they were led to more radicalized political movements that not only called for political freedom, but to also transform their societies anew. These latter ideologies were what the princes and their representatives repeatedly called extremists. Dismissing the implication that the two parties of the native states and the British provinces are of equal status, Khan goes on to declare that any constitutional scheme which it is intended, Khan goes on to declare that, quote, any constitutional scheme which it is intended that the states should accept must necessarily recognize the incontrovertible fact that whereas the Indian states enjoy and exercise sovereign power and authority, the other federating units of the proposed federation are neither sovereign nor autonomous. Hence, the Constitution must necessarily provide adequate and substantial safeguards for the maintenance and preservation of the internal sovereignty of the states. End of quote. So Khan argues that there is a fundamental difference between Indian states and British Indian provinces, and that while the princes might have to sacrifice a few things when entering into negotiations, the provinces were in a completely different position. The provinces sought to gain authority over internal administration through federation and dominion status. However, the native states only stood to lose what they already possessed, namely internal sovereignty. It was with this apprehension that the native states entered into the roundtable discussions on the structure of an all-India federation. The protective stance the princes took on holding on to what bit of sovereignty they had, however, was interpreted by Congress leadership as their unwillingness to introduce political reforms within their territories to expand citizenship rights and representative government. It became clear that the federation proposals from the princes and their administrators were not animated by emancipatory politics, as was the case with the West African proposals that Cooper describes, Frederick Cooper. The Indian National Congress, while negotiating at the roundtable conferences with the princes, simultaneously decided to take on more radical politics by turning to the native states' peoples. In effect, the Congress, after the long drawn out discussions with the Indian princes, decided to give up on the federation idea and rather pursued a radical democratic agenda to support people's movements within the native states towards representative government and parliamentary democracy, thus firmly committing themselves to popular sovereignty. Overall, the movement against federation, orchestrated by the Congress, ultimately taking a liberal nationalist position, was that a loose federation proposal threatened the furthering of democratic reforms. Susan and Lloyd Rudolph argue that India's commitment to federalism was a way to share and negotiate divided sovereignty. Louise Tillen posits that the quasi-federalism adopted by India in 1947 was critical in democratic consolidation. What we see from the discussions from the 1930s is that the Indian National Congress was able to forge conservatives and socialists behind its proposals for independence. This lasting coalition of potentially divergent political goals allowed Nehru and Gandhi, along with the Congress, to push toward the goal of an independent nation state, as seen in a Congress narrative triumphant in the Constituent Assembly. For Nehru, however, political and economic stability would result from an Indian union with a strong center and not a loose federation of states and provinces. This was the critical point of contention between the parties representing the political interests of minority communities, such as the Muslim League and Ambedkar's advocating of Dalit interests. The Muslim League in particular proposed a loose federation of states and provinces in order to accommodate the political interests of the Muslim minority. Under the leadership of Nehru, the idea of a nation state with a strong center took hold. As a consequence, the Congress shifted political discussion and negotiations from a federation, the All India Federation as proposed in 1935, to an Indian Union, which required that all peoples in former Indian states and in British provinces would have equal protections and rights. For Nehru, this would be the realization of a radical democratic project in India. The Congress began to shift their strategy with the native states after the roundtable conferences that resulted in the Government of India Act of 1935 and their victories in 1937 of Congress in the 1937 elections. The global movement towards the nation state as the legitimate state form rested on the idea of popular sovereignty. A popular sovereignty based on constitutions, minority rights, and the accommodation of cultural diversity. The All India States People's Conference, established in 1927, signaled a shift for the Indian National Congress towards the goal of demanding greater rights within the princely states for what they outlined as the state's subjects, mainly the expansion of civil liberties, citizenship rights, and representative government. At the Calcutta session of the Congress in 1928, Nehru moved to remove the clause that stated that the Indian National Congress would not interfere with the internal affairs of native states. The Congress declared, quote, "This Congress urges on the ruling princes of the Indian states to introduce responsible government based on representative institutions in the states and to immediately issue proclamations or enact laws guaranteeing elementary and fundamental rights of citizenship, such as rights of association, free speech, free press, and security of person and property." This Congress further assures the people of the Indian states of its sympathy with and support to their legitimate and peaceful struggle for the attainment of full responsible government in the states, end of quote. Nehru declared that the political task in the princely states that was different from within the British Indian territories. In the princely states, Nehru argued the political goal was the attainment of full responsible government, inclusive of representative institutions and based on popular sovereignty. Obviously, this posed a significant threat to the princely states, whose respective monarchs had not entertained the thought of giving up any power, especially in such a radical manner as turning that power over to representative institutions. From the perspective of these monarchs, joining a federation with an independent India would mean essentially surrendering their power. Gandhi, too, was a strong critic of the arbitrary power of the princely states, Indian princely states, having himself come from a small princely state in Gujarat. Gandhi's political philosophy was based on an idea and commitment to self-rule. In his classic Hind Swaraj, Gandhi addressed his interlocutor within the text on the idea of freedom and self-rule, and he asserted that I'll just skip this long quote because we're running out of time. So just to summarize that for Gandhi, the idea of self-rule was when Gandhi entered the nationalist movement and joined Congress-led agitation against colonial rule. One of the tenets of Indian nationalism, as articulated by early nationalists such as Naroji or Gokhale, was that Indian representatives in the government are better positioned to govern over their own people because they have an ear to the concerns and interests of their own community. Gandhi, on the other hand, early on argues that it is not simply the replacement of European bodies with Indian bodies that would alter colonial rule. Rather, it was a radical politics based on popular sovereignty. For the idea of self-rule to take root in princely states, the people have to do constructive work to prepare them to then chart out a political program. Gandhi, even as late as 1938, was hesitant in the Indian National Congress, providing aid to people's movements within the princely states. So there was a hesitancy, generally to allow the people to express themselves without British Indian interests shaping those interests, right, and movements. He felt that both the princess and the people need to come around to trust the Congress in their work. However, in Harijan on April 20th, 1940, Gandhi wrote that though in law princely states are independent, it is not worth much because it is defended by a stronger party, the British Empire. Gandhi argues that the princes will have to come around and join the Indian Union as it is in the best interest of the state's people as well as in their own interests. He writes, I can there only conceive a settlement in which the big states will retain their status. In one way, this will be far superior to what is today. But in another, it will be limited so as to give the people of the states the same right of self-government within their states as the people of the other parts of India will enjoy. They will have freedom of speech, a free press, and pure justice guaranteed to them. End of quote. Furthermore, by 1942, Gandhi explicitly contends that the arbitrary power of the princes must go, and that their autocracy must go, and that the liberty of the people should not rest on the will of a single individual, the autocratic monarch. While Gandhi undercut the idea of an uneven Indian Union, the peoples of the princely states must enjoy the same rights as the people of the provinces when India achieves independence. He rightly points out that the princess autocracy rested on British protection and that their power did not derive from within. After British departure, the princes could retain their states when joining the Union, as they would join as stronger than ever before, having achieved independence. However, Gandhi ultimately argued that the autonomy and strength must derive from the people and not the monarch. Ambedkar approached the question of the princely states' sovereignty with skepticism and put the blame on the British for their shirking of responsibility and encouraging the princes to seek autonomy from an Indian Union rather than working with Indian nationalists towards a common goal. Ultimately, Ambedkar argues that it is in the interest of the princes to join the Indian Union as it guarantees that they can remain constitutional monarchs and retain their rights to dynastic succession. Unlike Gandhi, Ambedkar saw the monarchs as self-interested political actors who can be convinced to join the union because it would benefit them. Gandhi, adhering to his political philosophy, saw the princes as good ethical actors parallel to the common people of the native states. As ethical actors, the princes too, in Gandhi's eyes, should desire what is good for their states and their people. Gandhi and Ambedkar, along with Nehru, were all committed to popular sovereignty, the idea that political power ultimately rested with the people, not old world monarchs. Even if the monarch represented heritage and tradition, both Gandhi and Nehru believed their political commitment to independence and freedom was necessarily tied to a people gaining political power. The Congress made an additional commitment to the will of the people of India when they declared a constituent assembly as an integral part of the official policy in 1934. At the Bombay Conference of the Indian States People's Conference on December 17th, Bahadur M. Ramchandra Rao declared that, quote, "It is obvious, however, that in our struggle for national emancipation and for the development of India as whole into a self-governing world state, the people of British India and the Indian states have to act in concert till the goal is reached." Ramchandra Rao went on to say that reforming the internal administration in the Indian states was of utmost importance, possibly even more so than the federal union between the Indian states and British India. The immediate problem to tackle was the position of the prince, who ruled personally with control over legislation and administration. Rao argued that the prince's rule was essentially feudal and patriarchal in nature. No matter how enlightened a prince, there was no guarantee that the successor would be equally enlightened. Therefore, Rao declared that, quote, a settled constitution which recognizes the responsibility of the administration to the people and containing all the essential elements of a popular government is the only safeguard for the protection of the people, end of quote. So I'll stop here on some of the critiques of and the problem of monarchy within the broader anti-colonial movement. And what I presented today is part of this larger book on political imaginaries in early 20th century in Hyderabad and British India, primarily Madras Presidency and primarily Telugu-speaking districts in the Madras Presidency. Specifically focused on discourses of self-determination and federation within this broader framework and discourse of anti-colonialism. And what I'm interested in is to tease out what arguments the Hyderabad administration made in their discussions at the roundtable conferences with other princes and also with Congress nationalists. How did they view anti-colonial nationalism is the questions that I began this project with, and how did they respond to the call for expansion of representative institutions within Hyderabad and the call for political reforms? So I will end here so we can have time for questions.
Thank you so much, Rama. It was really wonderful not listening you. You have actually told us many things. It is very difficult to comprehend all. I think all these are now coming in the book, so we look forward to read the book. As you said, this All India Federation of princes was actually working within the lines of Indian National Congress, and trying to force them within this larger nationalist politics. And Hyderabad state was not a very active part of this forum. So Nizam was always trying to assert his autonomy. Even after declaration of independence, also he was saying, I am independent Raja. I have my own currency. I have my railway. I have my telephone, postal, and airplane. So he used to give all these examples. So yeah, fact, as you are saying, they were trying to actually assert their autonomous space, and there were also negotiating to accommodate this autonomous space within the larger Indian federal system. But this was, I believe, taken in a different way. You talked about this conservatism. Conservatism, as you said rightly, is basically to retain and preserve their legacy and the contribution they made. That is very much actually visible in Hyderabad state. Hyderabad means Nizams. They allowed political reforms, administrative reforms, but they try to again assert their court culture and other princely gestures and attitudes and all that. Means during Salar Jung, even this government officials were not allowed to go to ball dance in the residency. So so there were these kinds of attempt by these but unfortunately this is all read in a different language. It is a very unfortunate. Even you are talking about a popular sovereignty. From 1920s there were election for Hyderabad municipality. And
Mhm.
in a way, he was the one who introduced reservations as well. And this Arige Ramaswamy was chosen as a Dalit representative in the Hyderabad municipal corporation. And there was constitutional reform committee after 1935
Right.
act. And then so ultimately there was a representative government, a Dalit leader become education minister in the Nizam government. So all
Mhm.
this, I mean, what I'm trying to tell is there was a analogy, and there was a parallel to British political reform in the Hyderabad state as well. But unfortunately, I mean, somehow this is a completely constructed opposite to what actually happened in Hyderabad state. See,
Mhm.
we have seen how I mean, free was this freedom of speech you are talking about. Now, Golconda Patrika was openly critiquing Nizam, anything like it was like a, I think toughest critic of Nizam policies and all that. But he never banned Golconda Patrika. I mean, so we
Mhm.
should realize that. Whereas in British India, many newspapers were banned and crushed down. There was a lot of serious persecution and all that. But nobody notices. I mean, so what was happening in Hyderabad state. So I mean, so even Nestle's Congress, of course, banned. Of course, any state which was working against them, definitely they will ban. So there were some actions by the state against the now political mobilizations. But if there is some cultural mobilizations, very lavishly, Nizam and his government, supported them. So
Mhm.
hope all this, I think, coming in book. Look forward to read your book. So the presentation is open for discussion. You can ask questions directly to Rama. You can open your camera and ask, or
Mhm.
you can also write in the chat box. Can you read, Rama, questions from the
Yes.
chat box if
Yes.
there
I,
are any?
yeah.
So to just start up, I mean, so you at the end said, see this, I mean, Muslim League, of course, was talking about this provincial autonomy.
Yeah.
You also mentioned Ambedkar was talking for provincial autonomy. I don't think so. Ambedkar was for very a strong supporter of a centralized kind of nation, not
Yeah.
for loose federation.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
am I right, Amit, or I heard wrong?
No, the Ambedkar piece that I brought in was more to say that he was critical of the princess and talking about uh, rights of the people's subjects more than that he was actually also kind of in line with the popular sovereignty, right, to be realized within the princely states as well. But I think like if you so I end. In the 1930s, right, by the late 1930s. In this presentation, things get more complicated in the 40s, of course.
Yeah, yeah, of course,
Um,
yeah.
but in the what that transition when Congress by 1927 and 28, when they decide that they're going to actually support the people's movements, as they say, the state's people's movements, and that they will, so that they can be concerned about the internal affairs of the native states, whereas before they said we won't interfere, right? So they have these different levels of, what they think they can accomplish by supporting movements that already exist. Um, so Ambedkar, involves, he's dismissive of most of the princes and their lawyers who claim that they have, that they can regain their sovereignty, right, in the reading of treaties and stuff. So he is
Mm.
dismissive. So for sure, he's not supporting the princess, but I think he's trying to carry that conversation further, right, rather than eroding I don't, at this moment, they're not ignoring the princess, because they could just ignore the princess and administration and say, we're with the people, right?
Yeah.
But they don't do that. They're trying to negotiate so that they're, that it could move in the right direction, at least in the 1930s. I think they're still balancing the arguments that the princes are making along with their lawyers about treaties and sovereignty, and at the same time also calling for responsible government and acknowledging that the state's peoples have a different set of political goals that are in line with the political, the subjects of British India, right? Ultimately is what they're saying. They should be equal. And that was always the problem with federation. If you allow for a federated state, the princes, for instance, if they had different level of rights and civil rights and so on, fundamental rights, that's distinct from the other provinces, then you would have this uneven kind of federation, right? Which is what both Nehru and Ambedkar, I think, would definitely oppose that unevenness, ultimately. But what you were saying about the Golconda Patrika, I've been actually looking at the Nizam's I'm forgetting the name of it, but it's the committee that looked at all the publications, right, in the vernacular and English periodicals published and circulated within the Nizam's territories. And the Golconda Patrika repeatedly, they translate the articles, and they're repeatedly kind of called out for their politics. So, they've been watched very closely, because there is fear that their critique was too radical, ultimately, that they're questioning the authority of the Nizam and the administration. So often they had to then retreat from a political critique and only talk about economic or cultural, right? That if they so some level of critique was allowed, but the overt political critique was definitely called out, by the administration. So they were watching very carefully.
Yeah. Even Arya Samaj, though they were doing a lot of politics, I mean, so it was not banned. They allowed.
Exactly.
Okay. Anybody else? Please open your camera, or you can just directly ask questions. Vijay. Yeah, Varghese, please.
There is Vijay. Vijay, please. Vijay has a question, I guess.
Yeah, Vijay, please. You can ask question to Rama. Can you
Vijay, please
unmute? Unmute, please unmute. Yes. No, Vijay, we can't hear you. Can you unmute? Oh.
Okay, his question is in the chat box.
Okay.
He wants to be unmuted.
Yeah. Can you unmute, Vijay?
The host has to unmute it, he says.
Okay. Varghese?
No, I have already asked him to unmute.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay. Yes, we can hear you. Please, Vijay, ask question.
I am Vijay Borati from English Department of University of Mysore. I don't have a question, but a kind of intervention, because Rama's presentation is also linked, directly related to the work that I have done, which is published in Studies in History, but from different angle. Rama's presentation was something related to political history of princely states and federation process. But I have tried to look at the process of responsible government, demand for responsible government from a literary point of view. If I am allowed 1 minute, I would like to read a paragraph and then end my intervention. Am I allowed to read out a paragraph?
Yeah, please do it.
Yeah, this is actually, I have written, I've tried to understand demand for responsible government from literary point of view with a focus on D.V. Gundappa in Mysore princely state. He wrote several dramas. Some of his dramas were related to the issues of constitutionalism, political reforms, etc. So I'll just read out this paragraph. Hope I will be very clear in what I read. The case of princely states demands a momentary sidestep from the dichotomy of colonialism versus nationalism to understand the dramas in better light. If British rule, seen as foreign alien rule, triggered off the nationalist imagination of socio-political religious self in British India, what reasons did the nationalists have to extend this imagination in princely states ruled as they were by the native Indian princes? The slow and gradual entry of pan-Indian nationalism in the princely states did not have to combat British colonialism or colonial knowledge chiefly and directly. Much before its full blossom in the princely states, it had to grapple with monarchy, democratic institutions, constitutional reforms, bureaucracy, and other pressing local issues. The example of Kannada dramas in the Mysore princely state offers us a different perspective of having been written not with the sole idea of combating colonialism or the princely state, but with the intention of defining the issues mentioned above and for hegemonic purposes. They act as political allegories which imagine, debate, and offer remedies to the pros and cons of democratic reforms, which gradually became a part of nationalist discourse and the freedom movement later. They contain reactions to repercussions in social and political spheres. They promote hegemonic elements of normative political and social cultures. So, this is the gist of what I have done in my paper. I'm trying to say that literateurs like D.V. Gundappa, who was also a political thinker, tried to push forward the political agenda of the nationalists in princely states through literature, literary creativity. So, besides political history of princely states and its relationship with the democratic processes or constitutionalism in colonial period, literature also played a very important role in pushing forward the agenda of nationalism in princely states. So I just wanted to make an intervention.
Okay.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, Varghese. Over to you, Varghese.
Okay, so I have two curiosities basically. The first one is I wanted to ask you
Vijay, can you mute yourself?
Yeah, please.
The first curiosity is I wanted to know how unique is the case of Hyderabad. When you take the princely world as a whole. Because I'm asking this question from the vantage point of the late 40s, because you have heterogeneous responses from the princely India to the idea of Indian Union as well as joining. Say for instance, even in the South India, you have the king of Cochin willingly joining the Indian Union, and he was the first to join. And on the other hand, you have the king of Travancore, who dragged it, and that whole history. And both these kingdoms are basically self-proclaimed Hindu, kingdoms. So I'm just wondering. Of course, this is a clash of interests. Princes are trying to protect their interests. British are trying to protect their interests. Nationalists, and also the people. So in this conflicting interest, how would you basically understand these heterogeneous responses from the princely India? That's my first curiosity. Second thing, I was quite interested when you said that, in response to the idea of All India Federation, one of the counter arguments invoked by the princes was this idea of sacred heritage, right? Yeah. So I was just wondering, what is the sacrality that they are actually speaking about? Are you speaking about a kind of religious abstraction to the whole argument? Again, I have Travancore in mind.
Mm.
because that's quite an interesting divergent case, perhaps, in terms of this sacrality which is being involved. So these are two curiosities, basically.
Okay, Rama, you can respond.
Those are excellent questions. I mean, first I wanted to thank Vijay to bring in the Mysore case and the way in which nationalism, took root or disseminated within Mysore through literature, and that literature plays a big part of how anti-colonial nationalism kind of circulated, right? And so this question, the two, they're both excellent questions. The first is, why do princes react differently, right? And the two authorities on this, in kind of looking through the constitutional debates, is Ian Copeland, right, and Barbara Ramusak have looked at kind of looking at all the different, the small princely states to the large princely states. And it's not always, I mean, one would have to, take a closer look, maybe. They've done a kind of survey, and it is interesting to see, like, who are those who kind of align themselves with nationalism, right? There are some small states that do actually align themselves full on with Congress, nationalism, and they're fine. And some of them are the small states, right? So they know maybe in a way that their future might be only within a larger entity, right? But on the other hand, it also has to do with their own political education and loyalties and their own ideas, right? And then on the other hand, you do have these larger states, right? And Hyderabad was one of the largest state that resisted being grouped in with all of those small principalities. They didn't think they were the equal, right? They were more important and much larger, right? And that they could actually have more political power in that sense, right? In the negotiations. So there's that. In terms of why Hyderabad resisted as opposed to Mysore, or Baroda, different historians have, given different arguments about the kind of modernists that existed in the administration that kind of put the states on a certain trajectory, whereas in Hyderabad, there was a lot more reluctance to join the conversation, and even political reforms from the Salarjung, era was met with a lot of resistance, within the administration in terms of, what kind of, reforms would be instituted. So there was that kind of slower introduction of political reforms taking place. And so I think when Akbar Haidari does take part in the roundtable, it was because he says we can't ignore it because we might be taken along to something else if we don't even if we're not even part of the conversation. That's more dangerous, right? You can't just say, no, we're separate, we're autonomous, we're not going to take part. He says we have to take part, but in the taking part, he wants to make a case that he's fighting for more autonomy ultimately, right? And why is that? I mean, there are different ways in which people can, try to analyze that, whether it's the unique, like, individuals, who were a part of the negotiations. You can kind of like look into the biographies and the motivations and in that way. So for me, that political story can it can be a dead end, right? Because you can't really ultimately figure out why they did that. But for me, what was more interesting, so this federation conversation I chart out because ultimately I'm more interested in the public sphere, right? The Golconda Patrika and all the activists and all the political movements that actually arose and what they actually articulated, you know, to kind of whether they aligned themselves and how they aligned themselves with British Indian movements and nationalism, and how they separated themselves as well. And what those motivations were. The second question, I think I forgot. What was the second?
The
Sorry.
sacred heritage and
Sacred
sacrality.
heritage.
Yeah. So
Heritage.
I was actually just taken by that statement, first of all, of native states as conservative islands, right? So then I thought, oh, what are they saying here? And then when I saw the Khan's his own charting of this idea of heritage. So I held on to the idea of heritage more than the sacred, but I can see why with Travancore, I actually have a student who works on Travancore art history, and she's done this amazing, you know, work on it. Where actually she was talking about this, the sacral kind of and political power, right, in rituals of monarchy. So I think here it's mostly heritage. And so the way I kind of took it is the way in which Hyderabad itself, you know, is seen as a kind of the legacy of the Mughal, you know, state, and the retaining the historical borders as itself a kind of heritage, right? So I have not seen any kind of sacred conversation. You know, it was just kind of thrown out there along with heritage, but not in the context of Hyderabad, but maybe elsewhere it might be the case. But those are excellent questions. And I think more work has to be done, you know, in you know, thinking about that transition, right, with Travancore and Cochin. And I think it's a good question. It's something to think about, why some of them were readily willing to, you know, have the conversation, and others who resisted, you know, in the 1940s.
Okay. Anybody else? I think. So, students, anybody wants to comment, respond? Okay, then I'll request my colleague, Dr. Vijay Ramdas, to propose a formal vote of thanks. Vijay, unmute yourself, Vijay. We can't hear you. Hello, Vijay, we can't hear you. Oh.
I think he.
Hello, Vijay.
Seems that there is a problem with his audio.
Yeah, looks like
Yeah, he's
the same issue I encountered at the beginning.
yeah.
Okay, you just do it. I think it's fine.
Okay.
Yeah, Vijay,
Yeah.
now we can hear you. Vijay,
Yeah,
Vijay, now we can
Yeah.
hear you. Yes, please go ahead.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay,
Okay.
it's a formality anyway.
Okay.
Thank
Yeah.
you, Dr. Rama. You illuminated a very nice thing concerning the idea of federalism and anti-colonialism. I was actually reading the Anupescents, you know, how India wrought freedom. So it tells about, you know, origin and birth of democracy. So it's a, you know, aligning of that origin from 1880s. You know, intelligently put it in a way concerning the Hyderabad state. You also put forward regarding some of the princely states, like, you know, small princely states aligning with the Congress nationalism. There comes the idea of federalism. So we enjoyed your talk, and thanks for joining our webinar. It helped all our students, also those who have joined from the outside. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Rama. It's a wonderful talk.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you, everyone.
Rama. Once again, yeah. Thank you, everyone, for joining.
Well, I look
lecture.
forward to one day actually coming to the University of Hyderabad.
Yeah,
Hopefully, when
sure, we'll do that. Yeah,
pandemic.
yeah.
We will.
Yeah, once
Yes,
COVID-19 goes out, maybe when things will
yes,
be all right,
yes,
yeah, you
yes,
should come
yes.
We
down
will
to
wait for that.
Mantena.
Yeah,
Yeah,
we'll wait for
Yeah,
that.
yeah.
No,
Thank you
actually,
so much. Thank you so
every
much.
summer she used to come. So I
yeah,
And
think this summer we are missing.
yeah.
Okay, 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 Rama.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah,
thank you.
yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye bye.
Okay, bye, bye. Yeah,
Okay. Bye-bye.
bye.